My first experience with House of the Dead was playing the Wii ports of House of the Dead 2 and 3 when I was younger. I remember not getting very far, even with the additional lives and continues option, but I still had fond memories of those games. The original arcade versions were a little before my time, so I wanted to revisit the mainline entries, and it was so much fun to do so. The House of the Dead formula is simple. You shoot at zombies on rails, and occasionally try to rescue civilians along the way. The main games were developed by Sega AM1 originally for the arcade, and the first House of the Dead was credited for bringing zombie video games to a new audience. The Resident Evil series helped popularize the zombie genre as well, but I never really got into those games. The survival horror idea actually appeals to me a lot. Having limited resources to fend off against a horde of undead sounds amazing. However, the original games at least featured tank controls and a fixed camera, which are two aspects that I can't see myself getting used to. House of the Dead is way more simple, just point and shoot, and that's what I personally like. The House of the Dead games seem to have a lighter tone compared to Resident Evil, where they don't really take themselves that seriously, which I'm all for as well. With that said, let's have ourselves a little marathon here, as we'll be taking a look at each of the mainline House of the Dead games, excluding the newest entry, Scarlet Dawn. The reason being is that there's no way for me to play it, as the game was never released on any other system apart from the arcade. From what I've seen, Scarlet Dawn follows on from House of the Dead 4, which, spoilers, is my least favourite in the series, so I doubt I'm missing out on much here. As I mentioned before, my first and only real exposure to the franchise was playing the House of the Dead 2 and 3 collection on Wii, so I never got to play the original game. House of the Dead was released in 1996 in Japan, with Sega Saturn and PC ports following a couple of years later. The graphics look quite nice for a mid-90s arcade game, but unfortunately the PC version looks like absolute shit, with severely downgraded textures and almost no lighting to speak of. Also, the highest resolution that the game can run at is 640 by 480, and there's no external method of increasing the screen size. Graphics don't make a game, but just compare the arcade version to the PC ports and it's rather off-putting. On top of the low resolution, the game's music doesn't play at all on the PC. You have to install a third-party program and basically mod the music back into the game, and this is just something you shouldn't have to do. This port is the definition of half-assed, and even though the first House of the Dead is a pretty decent game, I'd skip out on playing it just because of this butchered PC version and go straight to House of the Dead 2. So yeah, House of the Dead on PC is kinda shit all things considered, but at least there's an exclusive PC mode you can access. In here you can select between a roster of characters, and they all have different properties like their hit points and ammo counts. This is a cool little bonus, but I'd rather have some halfway decent fucking graphics instead. Overall, the first House of the Dead is an enjoyable little game, and the story is actually kind of interesting, albeit very cheesy at the same time. Here's a quick rundown. A researcher named Dr. Curian creates bioengineered monsters to attack his staff over at his Curian mansion. Thomas Rogan and his partner G check the mansion out to try to save Thomas's bride-to-be, Sophie. The plot gets expanded and twisted in all sorts of different directions in the House of the Dead sequels, but still the story in this game at least is simple but effective. You have to rescue your girlfriend from bad guys. So basically it's the same plot as Double Dragon, but with science experiments and all sorts of fucked up creatures. Level 1 is set outside Curian Mansion, but then you eventually make your way inside to try to find Sophie. The title cards that precede each level are downright jarring to me. I mean, what's with this basic text font and weird film grain effect? I was baffled when I saw one of the game's title cards for the first time, and for the final level, they didn't even bother to capitalize the other letters in House of the Dead. Anyway, the gameplay is as straightforward as it gets. Shoot at zombies, reload your pistol, and save the odd scientist here and there. Yes, I said zombies. I know they're technically not undead because they were biologically engineered by Dr. Curian, But fuck it, they're basically zombies, so that's what I'm going to call them from now on. If you accidentally kill a civilian, you lose a health point, but if you manage to save them from getting eaten by zombies, most of the time they give you an extra hit. I like the risk-reward factor here, especially since you're also getting ambushed by monsters in the process, and you need to not only prioritize your targets, but have good enough aim to hit the zombie and not the civilian. The enemy variety in House of the Dead is awesome, and it keeps you engaged until the end. In the first level alone, you have the fairly standard zombies, dogs with wings attached to them, creatures that are covered head to toe in green slime, these worms that are festering on a rotten corpse outside the mansion, and many more. Even though you're having fun with the gameplay, what also keeps you hooked is seeing more of this diverse enemy roster, just to see what else is in store for you. In almost every level, there are branching paths that you can take, and I imagine that this would have been such an awesome feature to have in an arcade game back then. At certain points in the map, there might be a trapdoor you can break, or an elevator you can either take up or down, and these alternate routes shake up the environment at least for a little bit. You do wind up in the same spots, fighting the same boss fight and everything, but it's still cool trying to seek out these diversions in a level. It gives House of the Dead some replay value, and that's good considering the game is only like 30 minutes long. So before Thomas and G go into the mansion, a monster known as the Hanged Man kidnaps Sophie, and he serves as one of the game's bosses.
It's you! Sophie!
Good old Thomas kicks the front door in like an absolute badass, and once you step foot inside, you get ambushed by a pair of these demented monkeys as they're hanging on the chandeliers. Again, the diverse enemy lineup is great, and their movement and attack patterns keeps players on their toes. These monkeys show up again soon after as they burst in from the windows, right after a mad zombie busts down the door with an axe, Shining style. As you travel deeper into the mansion, you encounter the Chariot, the game's first boss fight.
Help!
That voice!
Help! Help!
Sophie, are you okay?
I was so ill!
Now, House of the Dead directly indicates the boss's weak spot to the player, which is a nice gesture considering that this game was supposed to steal as many coins as possible from you back in the day. The Chariot smacked the shit out of Sophie in this really comical way, and it's just one of the wackiest things I've ever seen in a video game. Anyway, all of these bosses are pretty easy, and this one is no exception. Just shoot at his weak spot until eventually his armor is destroyed, and then you're shooting at his exposed flesh. Yeah, the violence in this game was probably awesome to see back in the 90s, and the gore effects are still pretty cool. I mean, it's nothing groundbreaking, we're so desensitized to blood and guts in video games now, but the satisfying gunplay is what holds everything together. Level 2 starts out and we're already getting barrels thrown at us by this fat piece of shit. Little zombies dressed up in suits are introduced, and they're a projectile-based enemy which throws these tiny daggers at you. The player has to shoot the projectile in order to not get hit, so it's just another thing to worry about, along with their bouncy movement pattern. This level slowly reveals the underground laboratory elements, with engineered creatures coming out of test tubes, and this is great stuff. The Hanged Man has got hold of a pair of scientists, and you enter the second boss fight of the game set on a rooftop. My favorite part is when he kicks you off the ledge and you're hanging on for dear life, as you're still fucking up the boss. The next level takes place in Curion's laboratory, where the player has to fight the more advanced creatures in the facility. Even though I'm playing the PC version with dogshit graphics, the color palette is still nice and vibrant. There's plenty of distinct areas in this lab, and I'm glad to see it's not just dark and eerie. Alright, so towards the end of the level, you face off against Curion, and even more bad voice acting occurs.
Curion!
I must compliment you. I didn't think you could make it this far. However, This is it. Let's see how good you really are.
He runs off like a pussy and you're left fighting a gigantic insect called the Hermits. This boss isn't that hard, and while it's kind of out of place to see a creature like this in the game, I do like the large scale of the fight. In the fourth and final level, there's a boss rush where you need to kill the chariot and the hanged man one after another. I think this is completely lazy, and they use this boss rush idea again in House of the Dead 2. Having to fight the same bosses for a second time was just meant to steal kids' money back in the day. I understand that greedy fucking practice. However, it also makes the game dull, when the final level should be the most exciting. Anyway, Kyrian summons a monster called the Magician, but unfortunately for him, the Magician just kills him on the spot.
Who are you? Nobody gives me instructions. I shall destroy everything. What happened? Why don't you follow my instructions?
I really can't stand this final boss since his weak points are pretty small to hit, and he fires 2 durable projectiles at a time. The Magician is quite a bullet sponge too, but after some patience he explodes and the day is saved. Now there are 3 endings depending on how many points you have, and this, along with the multiple pathways, gives players good reason to replay the game. That all being said, I would not recommend seeking out the original House of the Dead, and would just skip to the sequel. I did have a good time playing, but there's no solid way of getting a hold of this game. The PC version sucks, the Sega Saturn version sucks, and the only other way to get the original game is through arcade emulators, and it's just more trouble than it's worth. Plus, House of the Dead 2 improves on literally every aspect from the first game, so without further ado, let's move on to the sequel. Sega AM1 released House of the Dead 2 in 1998, 2 years after the original game, and like I said before, it did everything better. The graphics are improved with more detailed blood and gore effects, there are 6 levels now instead of 4, and there's an entire city to explore instead of just a mansion. Instead of playing as Thomas Rogan and G, this game features 2 new characters, James Taylor and Gary Stewart. These guys work for the same government agency as Thomas and G, and early on in the game, you even meet up with G, who gives you his notes about the boss's weak points. The gameplay in House of the Dead 2 is basically the same as the last game. I mean, don't fix what isn't broken. However, I'm happy to report that the PC version of House of the Dead 2 is better than House of the Dead 1's port, slightly. The game's graphics are now on par with the original arcade, and don't look awful like House of the Dead 1 on PC. The PC port of House of the Dead 2 is still lazily thrown together though, with no graphical options whatsoever, and the resolution you're stuck with is still quite low. Anyway, the gameplay is the same, but the locations you visit are so much more varied, and the bosses are more interesting to fight. The voice acting is as shit as ever, and that is most exemplified by the game's main antagonist, Caleb Goldman.
My friends from the AMS, it's me, Goldman.
This guy has infamously terrible voice acting, and the lines that he delivers are just fucking brilliant. Brilliantly bad, but still. Basically, Goldman was the financer for Dr. Kyrian, and he is the one causing the zombie outbreak this time around in the city. So the big bad villain of House of the Dead 2 is just some nerd that helped fund Kyrian's research back then? Alright, I'll take it I guess. This whole game is so cheesy, and that's a part of its charm. If you want serious voice acting and a compelling narrative, then first of all, why are you looking for it in an arcade game from the late 90s? And secondly, that is not House of the Dead 2. I mean, some of the lines delivered in this game are just hilarious.
What the hell's going on in this city?
Don't know, but it's very similar to the 1998 Kyrian case.
That place?
Even the civilians that you rescue have some goofy bits of dialogue, and it makes the game all the more enjoyable.
Help! What's wrong with this city?
Even though the first level isn't that challenging and doesn't include any noteworthy encounters, it does perfectly illustrate the wider zombie outbreak unleashed upon the city, which I like. There's plenty of civilians to save, and there are monsters coming from everywhere it seems. Tiny slug creatures crawling out of the vent shafts, zombies leaping up from bridges, and also throwing axes from windows.
Don't come! Thank you. Please take this.
The boss in level 1 is this giant headless knight, and his weak spot is the little demon that flies alongside him. This boss is pretty cool, and soon after you meet up with teammates Amy Crystal and Harry Harris, who tell you to travel down to the city bridge. The next level begins with some driver getting harassed by zombies, and yeah, this game is awesome. House of the Dead 2 has constant action, and it's much improved from the first game in the series. Also, is it just me, or does level 2's music sound kinda like this track from Contra? The nimble, projectile-based zombies return from the first game, and this time they are running across rooftops like in Assassin's Creed. There's a fucking double chainsaw-wielding zombie that busts out of a building later on in the level as well, and I just love how each enemy introduces themselves in this game. It's all incredibly creative and entertaining to watch. The second boss you fight is against this fish monster with a trident. All you need to do is shoot at his chest when it's exposed, and yeah, he isn't too much to worry about. The next level is one of my favorites in the game, as you're riding through the city on a speedboat with Harry and Amy. Zombies come up from the water like Jason and also dangle from bridges, and I'm a fan of all of this.
Are you alright, James?
Yeah, I'm hanging on.
The only cliche part about this level is the obligatory bats that fly in front of you as you enter here. A 5-headed serpent creature serves as the boss of level 3, and he clearly telegraphs his attacks, making him pretty easy to take care of. Plus only one head will shoot at a time, which is a blessing. Next up, the player is traveling through this underground passage to the Colosseum, and this is probably the weakest level in the game. It's just not that memorable in comparison to mowing down zombies in the city, riding on a speedboat, or any of the levels coming up. At least you get some classic Goldman dialogue after, as well as the best boss fight in the game.
People of the AMS, I am Goldman. I don't care if you people try to get in my way or not. In time you'll find out who's right. This is a present from me to you. Look at your left.
So you're pitted up against an insane chainsaw-wielding giant, and the way that this dude charges through walls and surprises you from above is fantastic. Although this boss is pretty simple to kill, all you have to do is target his head, the fight itself is still chaotic and fun due to his frantic animations and menacing design. Level 5 is amazing, with you getting into a car to ride off to Goldman's headquarters, and god damn it! Yeah, a boss rush takes place in this level and it honestly sucks. You have to fight the Headless Knight, the fish monster with the trident, and even the magician from the first game again. If there weren't small sections where you shoot at zombies while speeding in your convertible spliced in, this would have definitely been the weakest level in the game. The boss rushes are absolute shit, and all they do is waste the player's time. Like I said, the magician marks his return in House of the Dead 2 here, and it performs the same bullshit attack patterns as before.
Only man himself can control its fate. You're nothing.
At last, you've come. Friends, the door of fate shall open.
Moving on from the stupid boss rush, we get a pretty climactic final battle as you head up Goldman's tower. Here you go head to head against robots with laser swords on their arms, cybernetic creatures that can pass through walls like the liquid metal Terminator, and also the boss from the third level. Again, This repeat boss fight shit is unbelievably irritating, but luckily the final boss itself is solid. Goldman unleashes a being only known as the Emperor, which, let's face it, is a badass name.
I've been waiting for you, friends.
Goldman! Do you know what you're doing?
I'm fully aware of what I'm doing. Can't you see? Man committed a sin, disturbing the life cycle of nature. The original sin that man is responsible to protect the life cycle. I have made a creature to rule over mankind.
He launches these metallic balls at you as well as phantom versions of previous bosses, which is the right approach you take when you want to repeat boss fights, by the way. I like how they incorporate previous bosses into this fight without the stupid boss rush gimmick, and the Emperor is probably the best boss aside from the insane chainsaw giant. Once you defeat him, Goldman commits suicide, and that's House of the Dead 2. I'd recommend getting this game, along with House of the Dead 3 if you have a Wii, or just download them both for the PC, although the PC version is lacking any graphical or resolution settings. House of the Dead 2 is such a step up from its predecessor, and it's the most popular game in the series for good reason. That being said, House of the Dead 3 is my personal favourite though. Set 2 decades after the previous game, House of the Dead 3 puts G back in a leading role, along with Thomas Rogan's daughter Lisa. The world is in a post-apocalyptic state, and Thomas has been missing after a raid on one of Curion's research facilities went wrong, as set up in the game's opening level. While the voice acting still isn't good in the slightest, the story is actually pretty decent for a House of the Dead game at least.
You getting along with Rogan?
I don't know. My father always put work ahead of his family. I barely have any memories of him spending time with Mom and me.
Ouch. That's pretty harsh.
In between each level, there are flashbacks that depict Dr. Curion trying to save his son from a terminal illness. That's where his research began until he went mad and started unleashing monsters around his mansion. This is surprisingly compelling for an arcade rail shooter. The flashbacks with Dr. Curion and the return of Thomas Rogan ties the trilogy together in a nice way, and would have served as a solid conclusion to the series. But unfortunately, House of the Dead 4 messed that up and it sucks. Like the previous 2 entries, House of the Dead 3 was ported to PC, and we finally have video settings. It took them 3 fucking attempts, but there are now extra resolutions and a couple of other bells and whistles. There should be way more, and they're still doing the bare minimum for this PC version, but at least it runs okay. House of the Dead 3 has extremely similar gameplay, so if you've played any of the other games in the series, you'll be right at home here. Instead of a pistol, the player is equipped with a shotgun that is visible on screen, which is a nice change to the formula. Obviously, a shotgun sounds more powerful than a little pistol, so the gunplay feels more impactful as a result. Instead of rescuing scientists or civilians, you're just covering G from the zombies. It's a little less cool than saving people from getting mauled by the enemies, but at least it makes sense with the story. You are exploring an abandoned facility after all. The graphics have been improved with a new grounded art style, and even though House of the Dead 2's graphics has its charm, I definitely prefer the direction this game went with. Level 1 is only a quick prologue to explain how Thomas went missing in Curion's research facility, and it's level 2 when the game really begins. Lisa and G hop out of their truck and you're able to choose which route you want to take in the level. The multiple path system is way more blatant than previous entries, because a prompt will come up where you pick which location you want to visit. In House of the Dead 1 and 2, the alternate routes are accessible within the actual gameplay, and might have been too cryptic for some players. I like the system they implemented in House of the Dead 3 better, and you can unlock up to 4 different endings depending on when you visit certain locations in the game. I love how the Gore Effects look in this game, and the way that you can blow enemies into pieces even after they're on the ground dead is fantastic. The fat zombies make their appearance in the second level, and these guys are my favorites. You shoot holes into their stomach and it's incredibly entertaining. The boss makes his presence known shortly after, and he shows up for a second time later on in the game. He's just some hulking security guard zombie with a club that chases after you. Shoot at his head enough times and he'll slow down.
Gee, there!
Got it. Lisa, slide under it.
Then there's a boss fight against some giant sloth, and his weak point is his feet. The security guard returns, but not in the cheap House of the Dead 1 and 2 boss rush way. You did not kill him during your first encounter, so he comes back for revenge. Yes, I know it is still kinda lazy for them to recycle the same boss, but still there's at least a decent reason to fight him again. The worst boss in the game is definitely this plant creature. The plant just sits there as you lay waste to it, while killer tentacles attack you sometimes, and there's the occasional bunch of projectiles you need to clear out too. This boss is boring and definitely the low point of House of the Dead 3. Lisa and G finally reunite with Thomas, and it's discovered that he was rescued by Daniel, who is Dr. Curion's son.
Wait, G!
Pleased to meet you, Mr. G. My name is Daniel Curion. Dr. Curion was my father. I believe you knew him well.
It may be hard to believe, but he's the one who saved my life.
The final boss of the game is a resurrected digital version of Dr. Curion, which I think is a solid attempt to round out the series. House of the Dead 3 was the franchise's highest point and the best way to wrap everything up. But no, that wasn't the end. House of the Dead 4 was only released as a downloadable title for the PlayStation 3 in 2012. I didn't buy it back then because I was only 12 years old and was probably playing Batman Arkham City or some shit. I have no means of getting it officially nowadays, so I had to resort to tracking down an arcade emulator and playing it on my PC. This game takes place in between House of the Dead 2 and House of the Dead 3, and I think it's the worst in the series. You play as James Taylor again from House of the Dead 2 alongside newcomer Kate Green, but they aren't remotely interesting. Even though there are some flashback scenes with Goldman, they don't have the so bad it's good voice acting and all of the charm of the second game.
At some point in time, humans broke the natural harmony of the world. They came to know greed like no other species.
I don't have a ton to say about House of the Dead 4, it's just boring with almost no memorable levels or set pieces. There's a fairly decent level set in an underground train station, with a good chainsaw wielding boss at the end, but that's about it. The final two levels in the game are ripped straight from House of the Dead 2, which is just fucking sad. The gameplay is the same as ever, but this time you can throw grenades at the zombies now. Big deal. If this is the direction that House of the Dead has gone in, then I'm not really looking forward to a potential port of the new Scarlet Dawn game. I couldn't find a viable way to play House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn, but it looks very similar to House of the Dead 4, and that's not a good thing. In conclusion, House of the Dead is a nice little series that knows exactly what it is. I love when they fully embrace the cheese factor and give us the craziest boss fights possible. I feel like the series should have probably ended at House of the Dead 3, but that's just me. If I were to recommend these games to someone, I would personally seek out House of the Dead 2 and 3 only. The first House of the Dead got the ball rolling of course, but the second game is the real fan favourite, and I think that House of the Dead 3 is the strongest entry in the series. It's a real pain in the arse to get House of the Dead 4 working properly on PC, and there's not even an official port of the game available, so don't bother with it. If you want to know the story and to get a full picture of what happens between House of the Dead 2 and 3, you can just Google it. The future seems uncertain for the House of the Dead franchise. A remake of the first game came out exclusively on Nintendo Switch recently, but it's anyone's guess as to if they'll develop remakes of the other games in the series. Only time will tell, but for right now, do yourself a favor and have some good old arcade action fun by playing House of the Dead 2 and 3 on PC.